Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on when you may be watching this. I'm Jamie Muller, and this is the Grad Connection. So I wanted to wrap up the research series today, and I'm also wrestling with whether I'm going to continue these videos or not. I feel like it's kind of run its course, but I have a few other topics, but we'll see. I may go to more of like a monthly format where I do this once a month. Because I kind of have been doing it mostly weekly since I started. But anyway, let's wrap this up. So I want to talk about finishing the thesis or the dissertation. We kind of talked about lots of different things about the research process and such. But one of the things I acknowledge is a reminder that when you do a traditional dissertation, right, we're talking about chapter 1 being an introduction, chapter 2 being a literature review, chapter 3 being methodology, chapter 4 being data, chapter 5 being summary and conclusions, and you do the dissertation, then you publish afterwards. In that mode, typically when you do a proposal presentation or when you do the actual proposal itself, it's typically the first 3 chapters of the dissertation or thesis. And hopefully you've got those chapters pretty well solidified such that really after the proposal, when you're doing your research, all you really need to do is execute the research and then write up the final 2 chapters. You probably have some editing in those first 3, but you want those first 3 chapters as solid as possible so that you can truly focus on the data chapter and then the summary, conclusions, implications for future, limitations. There's lots of things that can be in that last chapter. So as it relates to chapter 4, the data chapter, realize that it typically is a presentation of the facts. It's not interpretation. It's not elaborating on what it means. It's really just a presentation of the data themselves. And so you really want to just let the data speak. And so that's the key thing, is saving interpretation and so forth and what it all means for the last chapter. The form of chapter 4 can vary depending on what kind of study type you're doing. So if you're doing quantitative research, obviously that chapter is going to be mostly tables of data, numerical data, and that kind of thing, and talking about statistical tools. And there are standard formats for methods chapters. But one of the things is just realizing that it's going to be lots of numbers, and it's more concise than if you were doing a qualitative study where you're presenting lots and lots of narrative. And I think one of the challenges with qualitative data, particularly in a data chapter, is how do you whittle that down? Because you don't want to present all of the narrative, all of the scripts, all of the interviews, everything. So that can be a challenge. But in qualitative, essentially, it's the narrative. If you're doing things and stuff research, oftentimes or sometimes this can be the thinnest of data chapters. Because as I said before, a lot of times things and stuff is where you're creating something and you're testing it under certain conditions. You have typically some expectation of performance, some level of efficiency or that kind of thing. And then it becomes binary as far as did it work or did it not. And so sometimes things and stuff, data chapters are pretty thin. And then lastly, I would say if you're doing a mixed method study where you're actually doing quantitative and qualitative, overall your entire document's going to be larger, obviously. So the form of chapter 4 can kind of vary. What I would encourage you to do is to work with your major professor, whoever your principal investigator is, major professor, your advisor, blah, 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 the faculty member that you work with, and try to get examples that are close to the type of research you're doing as an example so that you can see what that professor expects. Because, from professor to professor, it varies. I mean, obviously there's some consistency that's expected within a particular department or in a university. But a lot of times faculty basically have the ways they like things done. And so it's best to get an example, a prior example. But overall, regardless of what kind of data or what kind of study you're doing, I think one of the hardest things is figuring out how to weed out what's relevant and what's not relevant, and figuring out ways to present it as efficiently as possible, as far as page count is concerned. And so I would encourage you, like I said, I think the best way to do that is to get examples that are close to what you're doing as far as the method, and using those as a model or a guide. Then we'll talk about the final chapter. So the final chapter, and it can have lots of different names, summary, conclusions, limitations, future directions, or any of the above, right? But one of the things I'll say is what oftentimes happens in theses and dissertations is because you've been working on the project so long and you typically will see the light at the end of the tunnel. What sometimes happens is that the final chapter, suffers from brevity just because you're wore out from writing and doing everything. And so I want to encourage you to make sure that you allot enough time at the end to spend a sufficient amount of time on the last chapter, chapter 5, right? In my years of working with graduate students, I seldom see a thesis or dissertation where I think, that they've totally exhausted themselves on the last chapter. I think there's always room for adding more in that last chapter, and there's no other time that you're going to be more ripe to be able to talk about it, right? Or it's going to be fresher in your mind, or that you're going to be probably better at creating connections within the research. So make sure you allot enough time for that. Now, I want to talk about one thing that's common in most chapters is having like a summary, conclusions, implication section. This is where you do your interpretation. I said in the data chapter, you're just presenting the facts and you're not giving interpretation. This is where you actually provide interpretation. And I want to encourage you, as you interpret your data and talk about that, find ways to weave in and or juxtapose your findings against the existing literature. That might be, and trying to fit it in. I mean, the best final chapters in theses and dissertations that I see are ones that do a really good job of basically juxtaposing their findings against what exists out there already. And I think that's probably the biggest mission of this section in the document. One of the other things I would say is don't over embellish, don't overextend yourself in trying to reach too far in your conclusions and your implications. And this is as much art as it is science. And so I would be careful about overreaching in that. Now, if you talk about limitations, which is oftentimes something that comes up in that final chapter, make sure you just remind the reader. Typically, you've typically acknowledged what those limitations are in that very first chapter. You may want to go back and watch the video where I talked about assumptions, limitations, and delimitations. I would revisit that. And I didn't say it earlier, oftentimes that final chapter, sometimes people will actually revisit the research questions that kind of use that as a structure for the chapter. But nevertheless, make sure you remind the reader about the limitations that you would have acknowledged in the first chapter. And then lastly would be the future direction section, where you talk about, if you were to continue this research or do the research in the future, what kinds of things would you pursue? Another way to approach this section is to talk about things that other graduate students that follow after you could pursue or look at. Basically, what you're really doing is you're identifying the jumping off points of where you've stopped, right? Of where the future things could go. So that's chapter 5. And then I jotted a note down here. One of the other things that you do, two other things that you do as you're wrapping up the thesis or dissertations. One is you kind of finalize what I would call the front matter and the end matter. So in the front matter, you oftentimes have, title pages and acknowledgments pages and maybe a copyright page. You certainly have the abstract, right? And the abstract should be written last. After everything else is done, the abstract should be written. It's the final thing you should write. And you want to make sure that it's concise. You want to make sure that it provides as much information as possible, because sometimes that's the only thing people will read about your thesis or dissertation. So make sure that the abstract doesn't just provide a teaser, but actually talks about the final punchline of the results. And so include honestly, the abstract can sometimes be the hardest thing to write, because it's actually a lot harder to write concisely than it is to write without limit. And so I would encourage you, and oftentimes a lot of universities may have a limit on that. I know at Purdue, I oftentimes try to encourage that the abstract not go beyond 1 page, because you're kind of defeating the purpose the more you go on. But so that's front matter. And then in the back matter, when you talk about your bibliography, you may be talking about all kinds of different appendices. And I would encourage you, make sure and this goes throughout the whole document, but including in the appendices, make sure you don't include anything in the appendices that you don't have permission to include. You want to make sure you have copyright clearances to be able to include things, because sometimes people will include examples of instruments that they've used, like survey instruments or exams or those kinds of things, and those are copyrighted or can be copyrighted. Another common thing that you would put in the appendices would be like if you're doing human subject research, you would put like an example of the consent form. You would put the IRB approval in there. Same thing if you're doing research. Really, any compliance paperwork that shows that you were approved to do the research, you would put in the appendices. So that's kind of the back matter. And the other thing I would say is, at least at Purdue, one of the things that we do in dissertations is people put a CV or a vita in the very like in the very back of the dissertation. Make sure you spend the time to do that. Put that in there. And then I guess the very, very last thing to talk about as it relates to this would be formatting. And so that's kind of the last thing that you would do, is go through and make sure that you've crossed all your T's and dotted all your I's, and that you're basically following format requirements within your institution. A lot of times your particular unit may end up having a thesis format advisor where they have to review your thesis or dissertation. I know at Purdue, one of the things we also require is that we require that graduate students have their major professor run their thesis or dissertation through Authenticate, to try to head off any potential plagiarism where things are not properly attributed. So whatever institution you're in, make sure you kind of figure out, what are all the kind of conclusionary details you have to do once you have 100% manuscript. So with that, this kind of wraps up the research series within the Graduate Connection here. And like I said at the beginning, I'm kind of wrestling with whether to continue these videos. If I do, I'll probably do it more on a monthly basis, or maybe a bi-weekly, or whenever whenever the spirit moves me, I suppose, to do so. When I kind of feel like I need to say something that I think is relevant to graduate education or that kind of thing. So with that, I hope you have found this research series useful. I would encourage you, if you kind of jumped into the middle of the research series, you may want to go back and review some of the other videos. There's a tremendous amount of content out there, so thoughts on lots of different topics and so forth. But with that, let me wish you a great day. Hope you have a great day, and stay healthy, stay safe, stay warm. Thank you. Bye-bye.